Hey, so this is the lecture notes that we would be doing on Wednesday. But since we're going to miss that day of class, I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to at least hear my voice, if not see my face as we go through. So it's important to recognize that this move that we've seen in Manifest Destiny from the East Coast to the West Coast, all the way from really 1607, all the way through really Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, cool name, completing that sea to shining sea, and then the Transcontinental Railroad, and truly sort of having that opportunity to go across the continent is going to move. So it's now going to go even further west. And we're going to see this justification certainly by saying, we have subjugated the Indians, so we know how to actually take over dependent peoples. Interestingly, the British sort of looked at Native Americans and said, well, we already done this to the Irish before. So in some ways, there's a history of that. You also have what we've talked about with Frederick Jackson Turner and his frontier thesis, despite the fact that he was really incorrect about the frontier being closed. It was this concern not only that there's no more West anymore, for democratization and sort of finding that rebirth, that sort of Garden of Eden idea, but also that you wouldn't have enough natural resources and you're going to need to go find those abroad. And then we got to think about the Gilded Age. There's so much that has gone on, so much steam that is built up in this kettle that, you know what, it needs a release. So whether you have, the populists and all of the farmer discontent, if you have Jim Crow and racial tensions, you've got all of the strikes and protests, all of that going on. There was this thinking that, maybe we ought to just go fight somebody and get rid of that tension and sort of bring us all together. Now, you also have to remember that America was starting to see itself as a big time player. If you think about industrialization sort of getting us to the big boys table, Americans looked at this and said, you know what? It seems that everybody else in Western Europe that we've sort of been following is now carving up, partitioning Africa and Asia, particularly China with their spheres of influence. We don't want to be left behind. Now, again, when you think about this, at the same time that industrialization is going on, America really needs to be able to trade with other countries to be able to sell its goods, because part of industrialization is making goods for Americans themselves, but also being able to sell them abroad. So if you look, just in 20 years, the increase of American exports goes up, two times, and then it's almost going to be, two times again, just from 1890 to 1900. So when you're starting to think about this, you get yourself back to that whole sort of Darwinian thinking, but of course not Darwin himself, but the Spencerian, social Darwinism, that sort of translating this whole idea that some people are naturally superior to others. We start to see some corporations are naturally superior to others, but also this idea of some races being superior to others. So if you look at this cartoon, you will see a man who looks eerily like Teddy Roosevelt, carrying a caricature of a native, again, dressed with almost like a grass skirt and earrings and big lips, and carrying them up a hill to the schoolhouse. Again, schoolhouse being sort of the model of civilization along with Christianity. You start to really get this idea of what we call the white man's burden, brought to us by Rudyard Kipling. This idea that strong nations dominate the weak, and that's the natural way to do it. So in some ways, it's a little bit like social Darwinism in that there's a natural hierarchy, but a little bit like what Carnegie was talking about with his gospel of wealth, that it's a responsibility of the superior groups to help out the inferior groups. So, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captain's need. Again, it's something that we have to do because we are preordained to be better and more civilized as Anglo-Saxon English-speaking people, so we must help other people. Now, on the flip side, you got to understand that there were many people in the United States, particularly in the Jim Crow South, who said, how dare you be talking about the white man's burden and going to, quote unquote, help people far, far away and make them more civilized when, in fact, you've done nothing to help African Americans in the South, and in fact, you continue to subjugate us in the South. So there were many actually riffs on the white man's burden in terms of sort of other groups saying, "Oh, the hypocrisy," as you practice your white man's burden, but you quote pile on the black man's burden. Now we're going to get to this key individual, ATM, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who in many ways sets up the blueprint for what America should do if they want to be an imperial giant. And he looks backwards in order to go forward. So he looks back to the 17th century all the way up through the Treaty of Paris at the end of the American Revolution. And his thesis is that countries who were great at sea were great nations overall. And so he's going to look at the United States and say, in order for us to be a great naval power, we need to have a strong domestic economy, which at this point the United States is having. You need to have foreign commerce, which the United States is starting to have as a result of industrialization. You need a strong merchant marine. That means ships that are going to be able to take American goods abroad to sell them. You need a navy that's going to defend those ships. You also need colonies to provide raw materials. To, again, thinking back to what it's like when we were part of Britain as part of that empire, our job was through the mercantilist system to deliver those raw materials, but also be a ready market for those goods that were being produced. Now, when we think about Mahan, we also need to think about his main idea included a canal, because he looked at this idea and said, in order to get from the Pacific to the Atlantic through the Gulf, if you really are going to be a country that is bounded by two oceans, you don't need or you shouldn't have to go all the way around South America to do it. So he actually thought of the Isthmus of Central America, sort of the most narrow part, not exactly where it ends up in Panama, but he knew that that was absolutely crucial. For him, building up the Navy was of paramount importance. And he said, you can't be a first place country if you're going to have the fifth place Navy. So for him, he really sets forth this idea that Teddy Roosevelt is going to run with, both when he is Undersecretary of the Navy and then when he becomes president, once McKinley is assassinated. Now we're going to shift to Hawaii, because Hawaii becomes sort of the first example of the United States building its quote-unquote empire. Now, the United States had had a relationship with Hawaii. It had not been part of the United States, but Americans had gone there. And many people that were trying to travel to Asia looked at Hawaii and said, that's really the best spot for us to refuel when we're going from the United States to Japan and ultimately, hopefully, China. And you had already seen missionaries going to Hawaii to proselytize with the Protestant faith. Much like we'd seen before, they decimated the native population with disease. Certainly we saw that with the Columbian Exchange going all the way back to Columbus in the Caribbean. Now, I put a picture of my dad up here because every single time my family's gone to Hawaii, and again, if you live in California, Hawaii is a lot closer, he always says, Pedro, which is what he calls me, you know that Hawaii is the most isolated island chain in the world. So I guess if you look at the map, I think he's right in terms of being the farthest from any continents. It's pretty amazing if you've been to Hawaii, just how far away it is from the United States, still being part of the United States. Obviously, Alaska is about as far. It just perhaps doesn't seem as far because it's actually connected to the continent. Now, enough about my dad. So by the late 1800s, Hawaii has become a major player in the sugar game. And they have a really good deal with America to be able to send their Hawaii to the United States duty-free. Don't have to pay tariffs. And again, as I mentioned in the Tyndall notes, part of that was a reciprocal trade agreement that basically Hawaii said, we won't enter into an agreement with any other countries. But these Americans who dominate the sugar trade really piss off the native Hawaiians. And so you're going to have a leader, Queen Liliuokalani, who basically, says we're going to try to take back Hawaii for the Hawaiians. So she's going to say, Hawaiian nationalism, it's not about whites getting to make money off of Native Hawaiians, who you in fact have killed many of them through disease. And in turn, we've brought in, Chinese and Japanese laborers are brought in. This doesn't feel like Hawaii for Hawaiians at all. So it's interesting to note that William McKinley, before he was president, was in Congress, and he was part of a tariff that had the effect of actually taking away this really important position of Hawaiian sugar and made it so that it couldn't come in duty free. So now the Hawaiian sugar elite, the whites, are like, wait a second, we need to find a way to get to be part of the United States or get this deal back, because at the end of the day, our sugar comes in like from a foreign country, and that doesn't help us at all. So the sugar planters staged a revolution against Queen Liliuokalani, the nationalist who was trying to take Hawaii for Hawaiians. And the U.S. Marines actually don't go, they don't play a huge role, but they do come ashore and do aid these rebels, quote unquote, these rebels, and the Queen yields her authority. And she makes an official statement that basically is like, you know what, I don't want to do this, but I recognize the superior force and I don't want lives to be lost, so I'm going to give up. But I still don't think this is legitimate. Okay? So you're going to get a provisional government. It's not part of the United States yet. It is dominated by these white Americans. And you can see right here, this yellow is a circle of a crazy beard of a guy named Sanford Dole. You know the name Dole in terms of pineapple. But these whites who form the government basically appeal to Washington and say, we want to be annexed. Much as you saw once Texas had become independent back in the 1830s, we want to be part of the United States. Okay. Now, Benjamin Harrison, who's the president at the time, seems favorable to it, but then he leaves office. Grover Cleveland, who is a Democrat, again, he is the only Democrat between Buchanan and Woodrow Wilson. Again, Democrats tended to be less pro-business. He says, you know what? I've checked, and the Hawaiians don't really want to be annexed. Now, it'll only be when McKinley comes into power in 1897 as part of sort of looking at what is going on with Cuba, drawing us into the Philippines, that Hawaii is actually going to be annexed, okay, which happens in 1898, really an important year because of the Spanish-American War. Now we're going to switch our focus to Cuba. This is, of course, a picture of Christopher Columbus. We don't actually know what he really looked like, but this seems to be one of the sort of stereotypical images. Now, Cuba is only 90 miles away, and we know that Christopher Columbus, in his early travels, lands upon Cuba. And generally speaking, the Cubans have not been happy with the Spanish since his arrival. Now, it becomes most intense really in the second half of the 19th century. The Cubans are rising up. The Spanish are doing their best to put it down. But the Spanish Empire really is crumbling. It has been crumbling. Some would argue since the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but I don't think it goes just from the end of the 1500s. It's really on its last legs throughout the 1800s, certainly as we saw with the rising up in Latin America, really in Central and South America of the countries that used to be part of the empire and rebelled, and certainly that precipitated the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. Now, there are many Americans who sympathize with the Cubans, in part because sort of our revolutionary brothers and sisters, but at the same time, there are many Americans who have business interests in Cuba, and certainly an independent Cuba or a Cuba that wasn't controlled by Spain or less controlled by Spain would certainly be good for the United States, or at least for certain business owners. Now, what you're going to have here in Cuba is in the 1890s, the Cubans rise up again, and it creates a very hard to watch conflict. And what you're going to see here is the Cubans actually burn their own land to try to get the Spanish to leave. The Spanish are going to try to lock up people that they think are the good guys so that they can sort of separate the good guys from the bad guys. So in many ways, the people that become the victims of what are known at the time as concentration camps, but well before the term gets used, they're actually called re-concentration camps at the time, is to really, if we put all the good people in a place where we know they are, then we can hunt down the bad people. So there is a Spanish general known as the Butcher who is going to put people in camps. These images that you see, I know, are quite grotesque of just how malnourished people are in these images, and these images make their way to the United States. Again, Try not to leave these up on the screens too long. Um, and in many ways, these kind of images are going to get picked up by the American press, and they're going to create this impression that it's all the Spanish fault. When in fact, the Cubans were fighting fire with fire. So, but at the end of the day, Americans tend to be on the side of the Cubans. So we see this right here in this cartoon. Of course, the dastardly Spaniard with the American who is helping the damsel in distress. Certainly wonderful outfits that you've got here, turning that American flag into tights. And I don't exactly know what Uncle Sam, if that is Uncle Sam, is wearing right there. Now, you've got Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, who are both newspaper owners in New York. And they are going to look at the scene in Cuba relative to Spain and say, listen, if we can build up just how savage and atrocious everything is, then we can sell newspapers. God, if we can get ourselves a war, man, we can really sell newspapers. So William Randolph Hearst famously said to Frederick Remington, who was a famous artist, basically said, you go get the pictures, and they don't even have to be real pictures, but I'll get ourselves a war. So this concept of what we called yellow journalism, which was sensational journalism, maybe with a kernel of truth, but a ton of fabrication and hyperbole, gets us into this idea of jingoism, this we gotta have a war. Now, of course, there's no war yet, but it will be coming. Now, there's a famous letter that is sent from the Spanish ambassador that is called, his name is De Lome, and he writes this letter, and he basically criticizes McKinley for not doing anything, not necessarily not helping the Spanish, but what he's basically saying is he's really easily influenced. Now, at this point, many Americans felt that McKinley should have been acting in a more aggressive or confident or deliberate manner, but you couldn't have somebody else say that about it. So we could complain about our president, but you couldn't complain about our president. Interestingly, Teddy Roosevelt, before he was picked as vice president, under McKinley, had actually called him basically, so weak that he had the backbone of a chocolate eclair. And, again, we could say it, but De Lome couldn't. So it's one of those that sort of contributes to the anti-Spanish sentiment, although it is not actually what starts the war. Now, we're going to have a week after the De Lome letter, which really had not been sent to the United States. It had been sent from De Lome back to Spain, but had been intercepted and then printed in the American press. The USS Maine had been sent down to Havana Harbor, basically just to keep an eye on things. But it wasn't there to start a war, but it does explode. And everybody assumes that it must have been the dastardly Spanish. Clearly they did it. They blew it up, and therefore we need to have a war. Now, I put down there, where have we seen this before? And obviously it's important to try to consider, what has drawn us into previous wars. So certainly when it comes to ships, we have the Chesapeake and Leopard affair, which happens, a number of years before we even go to the War of 1812. I mean, you could also claim perhaps this is like what happened before the Mexican-American War started, the sort of shady circumstances under which it happened. We learn much, much later, some 70 years later, that it was actually internal combustion inside the Maine that blew it up. But that's beside the point, because in 1898, everybody, particularly Teddy Roosevelt, said it must have been the Spanish. Okay. So at this point in time, you're going to have war hysteria. You have Congress saying, we will give money for military preparations, but McKinley is still saying, I don't want to go to war. But you'll see on the screen this sort of pin, this button that people are wearing, like, to hell with Spain, remember the Maine. Teddy Roosevelt is pushing for war. You see right here in this political cartoon, clearly this brute has blood all over. He is the one who murdered the 250 plus people on the Maine. In many people's minds, there was no doubt. Now, when push comes to shove, there are moves that are made. We ultimately end up blockading Cuba from the Spanish. The Spanish declare war on us. We declare war on the Spanish. So we are going to be at war, which many Americans had wanted. And it'll later be called that splendid little war by Secretary of State John Hay, because it barely lasts 3.5 months. Starts in April, over in August. The Cubans had really done much of the work against the Spanish, meaning that we just sort of came in and mopped up. Now, that's sort of what happens in World War I as well. The French and British had done so much work that we kind of come in and mop up and then try to dictate what's going on. But more on that in 2 weeks from now. Believe it or not, we actually struggled fighting against these aging Spanish. We didn't have very good weapons. We didn't fight very well in the tropics, which is certainly something that we've got to consider as we're going to be fighting, in Vietnam some 60 years later. Not even the same type of climate. In fact, the American-Filipino War from 1899 to 1902 is even a better example of how poorly we fought. Bad food kills people. So anyone who dies really does not die from, on the battlefield. They often died from disease. Now, it's important to note that there were black soldiers that fought. They are not integrated with white soldiers. In fact, we will never truly see integration until the Korean War, although there'll be some experimenting with limited integration in World War II. Again, as I said, fewer than 500 Americans were actually died in battle, whereas over 5,000 died of disease. So always something to keep in mind. Okay, so we're gonna jump 10,000 miles from Cuba. So again, Cuba 90 miles away, fighting the Spanish in order to free Cuba. And even before we had gone to war with Spain over Cuba, we had, quote unquote, told the world in the Teller Amendment that we have no interest in keeping Cuba, that we want to free them, but we have no interest in keeping them. But we've got to think 10,000 miles away, the Philippines. Now, the Philippines become perhaps the most consequential piece of the Spanish-American War, despite the fact that that wasn't the original intention to start it. So you're going to see Teddy Roosevelt, who as Undersecretary of the Navy understands that if we fight the Spanish over Cuba, it's not the only part of the Spanish Empire that we could stand to gain or stand to, quote unquote, free. So even before the war starts, Teddy Roosevelt says, hey, I need you, George Dewey, head of the Asiatic Squadron, to head to Manila and just get us ready for this. So he goes in and he actually captures Manila rather easily. So as you see, our Philippine hero, oh, Dewey was the morning upon the 1st of May, and Dewey was the admiral down in Manila Bay, and Dewey were the regent's eye, them orbs of royal blue, and do we feel discouraged? I do not think we do. Wonderful puns that Greg Sherwin would love. But what we see here is actually Dewey becomes one of the heroes of the Spanish-American War. Interestingly, Teddy Roosevelt resigns as Undersecretary of the Navy and leads a group called the Rough Riders that goes to Cuba and actually famously charges up San Juan Hill, and he writes about his exploits, and he becomes the other great hero that really catapults him into fame. He becomes governor of New York and then ultimately vice president and then president. So it's important to realize that once you've taken Manila, you actually, we couldn't take the rest of the Philippines because we only had boats. And yes, duck boats go from water onto land and land onto water, but this is not one of those. So we actually needed to pull in Emilio Alguinado, who was an exiled Filipino nationalist who we ally with, who's going to help us defeat the Spanish. But we've got to also sort of consider, even after you defeat the Spanish, you have the Philippines, you have Cuba, what are you going to do? Like, at the end of the day, with this Treaty of Paris in 1898, what do we get from it? And why are people for it and why are people against it? So you've got people like Teddy Roosevelt, who again look at the influence of war and think this jingoism, this desire to go to war is just good for the country, particularly the Gilded Age that we've just suffered through in terms of the negatives. Now, in terms of the Gilded Age, you have all these industrialists who look at the opportunities to get a foothold in Asia and say, this is perfect. The Philippines is a jumping off spot for China. So not only can we have the markets of the Philippines, but the bigger fish is, of course, China. Now, again, the Republicans in Congress say this is a Republican war. We had a Republican president who got us in it. This is good for us. So we should try to take as much as we possibly can. This will help us. But at the same time, the argument was, you know what? We're already there. We've already got it. So why don't we just keep it as opposed to giving it up or quote, giving it back to another European country? But really don't give it back to the Filipinos because they're unfit, was the way that it was said. Now, there were people that were certainly against this. The Anti-Imperialist League, which was led by Carnegie and Gompers and William Jennings Bryan and even Jane Addams, who we will meet in the next chapter. But there are plenty of people in America who say imperialism is immoral. Who are we? Look at us. From the Declaration of Independence, we have said that human freedom is important. Certainly we've used this line of thinking many times in terms of sort of supporting our revolutionary brothers and sisters. Now, on the flip side, there's some people that are very much social Darwinists, very racist, who will argue, you know what, like we don't want to bring these inferior Asian races into our country. Certainly, we've already had the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and then renewed in 1892. So there's already been those issues. So certainly you've got this sort of moral, perhaps this noble idea in A, but also sort of this racist idea in B. And then, of course, you've got people like Samuel Gompers who don't want cheap labor coming over that will undercut union strength. On top of that, you've got this whole idea that says, listen, if you're going to have an empire, you got to have an army and you got to have a navy, and you might even have to ally with other countries because we're so far around the globe and we're going to need help. So ultimately, if you have an army, then that can only lead to crushing American liberties, which was, again, Thomas Jefferson's idea going all the way back. At the same time, from an economic standpoint, you've got sugar growers. Now you've got the United States has now got Hawaii, so you've got those sugar growers, and you say, well, we don't want even more sugar growing because that would only hurt us, okay? So the Anti-Imperialist League is actually not that well organized, and they, despite the fact that they have some big names and some big money, they mount a campaign against the ratification of the Treaty of Paris, but it does not work. So when you look at William McKinley here in this political cartoon, this whole idea of, are we going to be a civilizing agent for the Philippines? And of course, despite the fact that you have Lady Liberty standing right here, you sort of look over on the right and you see just the struggles that people are having at home. So again, sort of the hypocrisy of turning your back on the Jim Crow South, or really considering what you can do, quote unquote, for our little brown brothers and sisters, 10,000 miles away. So in the Treaty of Paris, Cuba is freed from Spanish rule, just like we said, in the Teller Amendment. The Platt Amendment will actually outline the conditions for freedom, which basically say that Cuba cannot enter into any agreements with other countries. Cuba cannot go into debt. The United States can intervene if it needs to. Plus, it can ultimately get a coaling or naval base that will turn into Guantanamo Bay. Spain gives up Puerto Rico and Guam, which are actually still part of the United States right now. The United States is going to pay $20 million for the Philippines and then going to need to decide what it's going to do. And ultimately, once the United States has the Philippines, it has the opportunity to become an imperial power. If it decides to keep the Philippines, that certainly would make it an imperial power. So we're going to actually stop right here. We're not going to do these cartoons. I'm going to do these at a later time.